Well, as you can see, once again, I am not in my study where I usually record. I am out in a garden. And no, this is not a backdrop. This is a real garden. And I had to come out and record this one in a garden because this time we have a Gothic story. Sort of horror, definitely Gothic, set in and indeed about the worship of, sort of, a garden. Her Wicked Roots by Tanya Pell. Right, so, Her Wicked Roots, which was released the 7th of October 2025, published by Simon & Schuster. And Pell, for this novel, was actually nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a first novel for this. And it's described by the publisher as, and I quote, a queer retelling of Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic Gothic story, RAPPACCINI'S Daughter, which is about a young woman who is lured to a lush estate owned by a botanist who might be hiding dark secrets. A fair description of this novel. I have a few quibbles, but not anything too big. I would say, as someone who for many years taught feminist film theory, and that included talking about queer theory, that their use of the word queer is not totally accurate. I do find that sometimes you'll see publishers and so forth refer to queer stories, and what they actually mean is these are stories featuring a romance that is LGBTQIA+, which, yes, sometimes that term does get used nowadays to describe that, and not in a pejorative way. Some of you, those of you who might be a bit older, who haven't, like me, but who haven't kept up with this kind of thinking, although you may well have heard the younger folk around you and things on TV and all use this. When I was growing up, queer was a rude word. It has been reclaimed, it has been rehabilitated. There is a whole body of work that actually calls itself queer theory, going back to sort of the early 90s. You get the idea of, cisgender. You identify with the gender to which you were born, and queer gender generally means by most people that you don't identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. It doesn't mean that you are trans. That is a different thing. It doesn't mean that you are homosexual. You can be queer gendered and heterosexual. It's very complicated, very nuanced stuff, and that's not what this is about. The characters in this story don't seem to be anything but cisgendered. We only get to know a few of the characters well enough to determine whether they would be cisgendered, queer gendered, that sort of thing, and they strike me as cisgendered rather than queer gendered or genderqueer. And it's also, given the Victorian setting of the novel, that kind of terminology is actually fairly anachronistic, although I'm not going to quibble too much about it because that's not in the book. That's the publisher's description. But anyway, there is lesbian romance in the story. It's, handled as a normal romance that just happens to be between two women, so, that's great. And so that's what they mean. This may be an unimportant quibble, but I do like accuracy in terminology. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding these days about a lot of these ideas and terminology, so to me it's important that these be correct. Also, And I hope that was coherent. I've had to stop a couple of times because of noise. I'm not going to do that too much. I'm not going to edit too much of the noise out because I'm in a noisy place. There's a lot of noise around me, so I'm just going to have to talk through some of it. It's something that sounded like a 20-foot tall lawnmower just went past, and I had to stop talking for a bit. But anyway, so a queer retelling, as I was saying, of Rappaccini's Daughter. Now, I will confess I've only sort of read this story. I'm not a big fan of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote Rappaccini's Daughter. I don't hate his work, but I don't love it either. I have read it. It was a while ago. I just sort of refreshed myself on it for this particular video. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. You can find it for free out there online if you want to read it. It is a short story. It's a longish short story, but it's a short story published originally in 1844 and this is the original publication place, the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. I have to confess I've never heard of this periodical. What sense of it I get is that it's a bit like the New Yorker in that it's, short stories, other, sort of articles, all kinds of different things. But it was published in that originally, and then beginning in 1846, the short story Rappaccini's Daughter began to appear in different collections, anthologies, that sort of thing. And it tells the story of a poor student named Giovanni, who is off to study at the University of Padua, or Padua as it's called in the book, the Italian northern Italian city. It's about, I forget now, about a half hour or so by train outside of Venice. I actually have been to Padua. I went to a conference there many years ago, and the conference actually took place in the University of Padua's buildings at the Botanical Gardens. And that is, I mention that because the Botanical Gardens in Padua may have been the setting that Hawthorne sort of had in mind for this story, even though he never names them, although he does talk about Padua and, of course, this garden. And just to really cut to the chase of what the story is about, Giovanni, from the rather awful lodgings that he's renting, has this view from his window of this beautiful garden, and he sees this beautiful young woman who works in the garden, tending the plants, and he finds out that the gardens are owned by her father, Dr. Rappaccini, and that she tends the gardens alongside him. In fact, she does most of the gardening. And she has developed, what he comes to find is that she has developed a kind of toxicity. She is around the poisonous plants so much that she has taken that on. So this is a poisonous maiden story, and there's a history of poisonous maiden stories in various cultures. And, he looks past that because he's very smitten by her, that he finds a way to meet her. They get to know one another, they fall in love, but then from his being around her, he too becomes toxic. And he gets his mentor his mentor gives him a sort of cure, an antidote, that if he gives this to Beatrice, the young woman, that this will cure her of her toxicity, but in fact it kills her. And it's not because her father objects. He has no problem with her meeting and finding a young man who can be with her. He's actually pretty happy about this. It's just that Giovanni doesn't want to be toxic. Okay, so we get multiple elements of that in her wicked roots, and and that's why it's considered a retelling. Now, I'm going to keep my description of her wicked roots as short as possible and as spoiler-free as possible, because obviously I want you to go and read the story. I do think it's a very good book. It took a little while to get going, I think. I thought it kind of got to the point very slowly. We got a lot of expositional material at the beginning. And while we needed that information, there might have been a better way to do this than the way it happened. It kind of is a bit of an info dump at the beginning. But once the story gets going, it actually was a very interesting, very enjoyable story. Her Wicked Roots is told in first person, and it is told by Cordi, or Cordelia, Cordi Beecher, who is a young orphan. She has grown up alongside her brother in a really horrible orphanage. Think your worst possible central casting Victorian orphanage, and that's basically what you've got. Sickly, starving orphans who die fairly frequently, abusive, corrupt members of staff who are supposed to be looking after them but really aren't, all kinds of, every kind of abuse you can imagine. It's a terrible place. But the brother and sister have stuck together. Cordi absolutely adores her older brother, Edward. And when he ages out and he has to leave, he promises, I will come back for you as soon as I have a way to support you. I will come back. I will bring you to where I'm living, and we will be, happy together forever. And she, absolutely believes him. And she is right to believe him. That is fully his intention. But, cutting to the chase, and this is all very much at the beginning of the story, after he sends her a fairly cryptic letter, doesn't sound like his normal way of writing to her and all that. She's a bit puzzled by it. Suddenly she stops hearing from him. And by this stage, she is old enough to leave the orphanage, but because she doesn't hear from him for a while, has no real sense of what's going on. She stays at the orphanage. She puts up with the abuse. She works for them, essentially for room and board, and is very much exploited by the people who run the place. And finally she decides, I can't do this anymore. And there are reasons that really push her that I'll not go into. But she decides, I've got to go and find out what happened to Edward. She knows the town he's been staying in. She knows the family that he was staying with because he was apprenticed to the husband of the family. So she decides, she's going to scrabble together some money. She's been saving what she can, but she effectively steals some money, though she sort of sees it as what they owe her, and she's probably right. And she sneaks out in the night and takes off to go on, the coach, the horse-drawn coach, to this little place called Faro. And when she gets there, she's, people are kind of, when they find out where she's going, they're like, you don't want to go there, just go somewhere else, start over somewhere else. But she doesn't have any money, and she's desperate to find out what's happened to Edward. So she ignores them, and when she gets to Faro, she finds the family that he's been staying with, the Starling family, and they deny any knowledge of him. So she leaves them just distraught, not knowing what to do, how she's going to live, anything, when their young daughter comes and finds her, and she gives her a loaf of bread, she gives her some shoes, and she says, actually Edward was with us, and he spoke of you often. He was, a very nice young man, and we think he must have fallen for a girl at Edenfield, which is the local estate, and we've not seen him since, and we think something's happened to him. So, very quickly, Cordi heads off to Edenfield, and by the time she gets there and knocks on the door, she lies. She doesn't say, I'm looking for my brother. She says, I'm looking for work as a servant. Please hire me. And to her surprise, to her relief, they absolutely agree, saying, yeah, you can work here for 2 weeks. We'll feed you, we'll clothe you, we'll take care of you, and if you're happy and if we're happy, then you'll be hired. Okay, so fine. And then after she's settled in, and she notices they seem to have a very strange sort of religious practices, right from the off. That she arrives at supper time, she sits down at the table to eat with them, and they say their blessing for their meal, and it's about the lady and about the garden and all of this. And well, that's not what I learned at school, but or at the orphanage, but whatever. And so she just goes along with it. She's given a place to sleep. She's sharing a room with this young maid that works at the house, Stella. And Stella's very quiet, very shy, but that's fine. Cordi doesn't mind that. She actually kind of takes a liking to Stella, who seems very nice. And she settles into her work, and she is trained on how to take care of a house and all of that sort of thing. She's learned this at the orphanage, and she's got a good work ethic, so they like her. And she's using this time to try and search for clues for what's happened to Edward. And to her surprise, one day the head housekeeper says, all right, you need to stop this duty because I'm going to send you into this part of the house, the mansion, the house, to do cleaning in there. But you got to be very careful in there. You have to wear a cloth mask. You have to wear these long gloves. You have to go in this door, shut it, put on your stuff, go on in through the next door. I will lock you in. I will let you back out. Here's all the instructions on when you're done, how to remove all of these things and your clothing so that it can all be properly laundered so that it's safe to touch. Don't touch your skin. Don't take off your mask. It's dangerous. Okay, but she does, because what's in there. Maybe she'll find out more about what's happened to Edward. And when she's been in there for a little while cleaning, she encounters two beautiful young women, Prim and Briar. And Prim is a bit brisk, a bit standoffish, but whatever. Briar, however, immediately Cordi is drawn to Briar. She likes her in terms of this. Briar seems like a very sweet, kind sort of person, but she also is sexually attracted to Briar. And this is how we find out that Cordi is a lesbian, and has no real problem with that, which is not entirely anachronistic. Victorian attitudes toward homosexuality are very complicated, and there's a big difference to them between male homosexuality, and they almost see that as kind of the only form of homosexuality, sort of, kind of, as it's more complicated than that, but essentially, yeah. Whereas sexual relationships between two women, they don't have as big a problem with that. So, I mean, it's not that Cordi expects to ever find, true love in the sense that, a wife and to get married and to live that life. She has no expectation of that. In fact, she says she always imagined that she would just live with Edward even after he married, and be, a beloved, helper and spinster aunt to his children. So she falls for she falls for Briar, and things look, fine for a while. Briar likes her. She begins to realize that Briar actually reciprocates feelings, but there's nothing they can do. They can't even touch each other because of the dangers. And Cordi doesn't really understand at first what's going on, why it's so dangerous, why she has to be all masked and gloved and everything around the sisters. But then one night, Cordi is sneaking out into the gardens because she's, again, on the hunt for information about what might have happened to Edward. She's had a few more clues that have led her to want to go outside to the garden to look. And she runs across Prim, who breathes on her face. And as soon as she breathes into Cordi's face, Cordi falls to the ground, desperately ill. And for an indeterminate amount of time, Cordi doesn't really know herself, it's just a while, she is virtually on death's doorstep. And the sisters and their mother, Lady Evangeline, who is this gifted botanist, and this, her home and all of that, they fight to save Cordi, and Cordi pulls through. And when she recovers from her illness, she is stunned to realize, as is the rest of the household, that she is also toxic, just like the sisters, that their mother made them toxic so that they would never be in danger from any man. Lady Evangeline hates men. No men are allowed at Edenfield. They do not come into the house. Occasionally, if they need a craftsman, which is how Mr. Starling and Edward ever came to the place at all, they will hire someone to come in and do their job, but they are only allowed in certain places, and they have to get out. They have to get out immediately. So, once she is essentially, living with the sisters, she and Briar take their first tentative steps towards a full romantic relationship. And she assumes that Prim is very jealous and angry about this at first, but then as time goes on, she begins to realize that they knew Edward. Then she begins to realize that maybe Prim knew Edward. And then she begins to suspect that maybe Prim murdered Edward. Okay. And obviously this is very concerning to her. But, long story short, she finds out that the garden, that there's some sort of strange, fantastical aspect to the garden whereby when one of the women of the household dies, the sisters plant that person in the garden and they grow, become part of the plants of the garden. And now that she's sort of become toxic herself through poisonous plants or through the same sort of poisons that the poisonous plants that were used to infect the girls, to the sisters, to make them toxic, she starts to find she has this really bizarre affinity to the plants. And so there's a body horror aspect to this as well, about the toxicity, and that she, when it rains, she wants to turn her face up and absorb some of the water. The way the sun feels when it hits her face is almost nourishing. She becomes very aware of the movement of water deep within the ground. She begins to realize that she has a sense of how the plants in the garden are thinking and feeling. So it's as if she has sort of ceased to be fully human and taken on characteristics, aspects, whatever, of being a plant. I'll leave it at that, because I'm afraid if I tell you any more, I will really, really spoil this. I will say that, the story has, it ends well, but ultimately it's the epilogue of the story that really made me sit up, because it's one of those it changes everything. Okay, when you read the epilogue of the novel, it changes everything that you have understood. And you've been getting this whole story from Cordi, first person limited. So everything is, Cordi is I saw, I experienced, I felt, I, did this, did that. We hear from another character at the end, third person limited, but we hear from them in a way that, as I say, it totally changes everything we've understood about Cordi's experiences. And Cordi herself doesn't know any of this, which I don't think is enough to make her an unreliable narrator, but it's got hints of that to it. So, yeah, this is the story. I've already talked about what I thought about, the sort of designation of it as a queer retelling of Rappaccini's Daughter. So, I won't go into that again, but I would like to talk a bit about some of the themes in this novel, because I think there's some really interesting stuff going on here. I think there are two main themes, and then ultimately a third theme that becomes more complicated. Okay, so the first theme is duplicity. Can we ever really know someone's intentions, someone's motivations? We can surmise it, we can be fairly sure, but can we know? And particularly with the presence of the epilogue, as I say, this idea of can you ever know how someone genuinely thinks or feels is hugely important. It's there throughout, and of course Cordi many times begins to wonder about, should I doubt Edward? Did he really intend to come and get me? Did he intend to just leave me behind? It would have been easier for him. He could start afresh. No pesky little sister to have to look after and support. He'd have money sooner. He could start his own business sooner, because he's a very talented wood carver and woodworker. He could marry sooner, all of that kind of stuff without me. So is that really what's going on here? He's just trying to get away from me. And then there's, of course, the duplicity potentially of a lot of the other people around her, particularly when she gets to Edenfield. Even the Starlings, because we do hear again from Mrs. Starling later on in the novel. And we know pretty much, from the time she meets them that there's something funky going on there, that they are not being truthful with her. But this idea of duplicity is a hugely important one, and it's something she encounters again and again and talks about as being an important part of her childhood because of her experiences in the orphanage. Another, and it's related to that, is the idea of safety. Cordi has lacked safety ever since she and her brother are orphaned and sent to live at the orphanage. He has protected her as much as he could, given the fact that he himself was a child Edward was a child within the orphanage as well. So he's in a very similar situation as Cordi, but she's his little sister. He feels very protective of her. So he does his best to try and make sure she has enough food, that she has the other things that she needs, that she feels safe. And as a very loving big brother, she does feel great solidarity with him, and she is not completely without love. Okay, so that's important. But once she gets to Edenfield, and even what we hear about Edenfield on her journey to Pharaoh and to Edenfield eventually, is how people don't trust it. It's dangerous. Again, this goes to the duplicity side of things. There's a lot of weirdness that happens there. They may be witches or something there. It's all, just the very fact that she's going to Pharaoh has people distancing themselves from her, people who are very nice to her until they find out where she's headed. So, and then when she's actually at Edenfield, there's something going on that seems very dangerous. And the fact that she is trusted to go into this very dangerous part of the house, as it turns out, and when she comes out of it, she feels a bit ill, and the head housekeeper has to give her this special tea, and once she drinks that, she starts to feel better. But she has to be extremely careful, so it's not safe. And then, of course, she does become toxic herself. She herself becomes dangerous to others, other than Briar and Prim. So, and again, the epilogue has us really questioning what safety is, and whether Cordi has, as she believes, found some kind of real safety in her life. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and it's less of an obvious theme, but I think it's worth addressing because of the way that Edenfield is described, that we have Lady Evangeline as the and just that's an aristocratic title. It is her estate. She is the scientist, the botanist who controls everything. Her daughters are like these two sort of maidens in the tower, in a sense, but also like the princesses in the tower. There is a real sort of structure and hierarchy at Edenfield, and it's all very strange. It's all very strange. It's as and it, on the one hand, I think there's a real danger of those reading it who don't know a great deal about these concepts, that there's a danger that people could assume that what we see at Edenfield is a matriarchy. And there's a lot of discussion on social media and online discourse, and probably other places as well. These days, certainly in my feed, this comes up a lot. And it is the idea of matriarchy, that we're living in a moment where people are so fed up with the system, and the system is patriarchal, that more and more people are saying, certainly a lot of women, but there are even some men and others out there saying, patriarchy needs to go, we need to live in a matriarchy. And others who assume that a matriarchy is basically just the opposite of a patriarchy. That patriarchy, because patriarchy is a very hierarchical system in which men are on top, women are inferior. Women are supposed to be subservient. In fact, we live in a white patriarchal system, most of us, where it's not just men at the top, it's white men who are at the top. And there are a lot of people who think that matriarchy is just that flipped, that women are at the top and men are beneath them. Men have to be inferior, men have to be submissive and subservient to women. That's not a matriarchy. That is something called a gynarchy. Okay? A gynarchy is the genuine opposite of, it is the genuine flipped version of patriarchy. Matriarchy is not what we get at Edenfield. What we get at Edenfield in this novel is a gynarchy. Lady Evangeline is at the top. Women are in all the important positions, and not only are men inferior in this system, men are forbidden. Men are absolutely not allowed. And this is made clear to Cordi in no uncertain terms, pretty much from the moment she arrives at Edenfield. Okay, so she isn't living in a matriarchy at Edenfield. She is living in a gynarchy. For the record, matriarchy is not hierarchical. It is non-hierarchical. You put mothers and children, particularly the children, at the center of it, and everything else is about supporting what is best for the mothers and the children, or the parents and the children, and flowing out from that supports everyone. Okay, if it's good for the children, it's good for the rest of us, is the thinking. So taking good care of them medically means taking good care of everyone medically, because we as adults are responsible for the children regardless of whether or not we ourselves have children. We are all responsible for all the children. We all take care of the children, and therefore that means taking care of each other as well. It is a much more egalitarian system. So that's matriarchy. Gynarchy is women on top, men inferior. Okay, and I think that's what a lot of people mistake, is they think that matriarchy is what a gynarchy is. Now, as far as this story goes, again, I don't want to say too much. The epilogue seems like we are heading more toward an actual matriarchy away from a gynarchy, although we don't get enough information to really make that determination, but it does seem to be the case. And Sort of. Sort of. And I think if you know the difference between a matriarchy and a gynarchy, then this is a novel that is critical of both patriarchy and gynarchy. But if you don't know this difference, I think you could easily mistake this as being an anti-matriarchal story. And I don't think it is. I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying that if you don't know the difference between a matriarchy and a gynarchy, you could make that mistake. Okay, so yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes this book so interesting. It was certainly one of the things that really fascinated me about it was, sort of what is this place that she is living in? Because they have this very sort of goddess-centered religion, and it's not like a sort of traditional pagan religion, but it is very gynocentric. And I would have loved to have had more about this religion that they follow come out, but of course it would have been a very expositional thing, and Cordi is not particularly bothered by it or interested in it, so we don't find out much about it. And I think that's fair enough. That's something you can talk about. What are their beliefs? Where are they coming from? How do these beliefs get formed? Are they a convenience to excuse this gynocratic system that they're living under? Or is there something else going on? So we're not talking sort of Wicker Man type territory or anything like that. There is some body horror. There is a lot of mystery. It is very definitely, unequivocally Gothic. I will say it's not scary at all. I don't know that it's even trying to be scary. I don't think that this book would, that Tanya Pell would consider this horror. I don't think. And I'm not just saying this because I have such a super high threshold for scary that it didn't scare me. I don't think that's what this story's going for. So, as far as how I would rate this story, I mean, that's tricky. It kept me going. I definitely, as it went along, enjoyed it. The epilogue I absolutely loved, but it took a while to get going. There are a lot of unanswered questions that it leaves us with, which, fine, but they felt more like holes in a couple of cases than actual questions, And I do think there's a difference between a plot hole and the kind of question that a good novel might leave sort of hanging in the air over us as we finish reading it, going, wow, what was going on there? And give us something to think about and to discuss. Saying that, and because it doesn't really make clear that last stuff about the system that she's living in terms of in terms of its being a gynarchy as opposed to a matriarchy and all of that, I'm going to give this one a three ghosts. There's a part of me that wants to go a bit higher, but I think that there are enough issues that I'd lean more toward the 3 than the 4. But yeah, 3.5. Okay, which is not, as I say, it's a good story. I really enjoyed it. I think you should read it. I think you would enjoy it. Most people. But I think it did need a bit more clarity. The reason that I would be anywhere inclined toward giving it a 4 is that epilogue. I adored it. Okay, don't skip ahead to it. Read it. Read the story as intended before you get to that. But oh wow, boy did it change things. So yeah, that's all I have to say for now. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next week for probably a film. I've lately been going back and forth, a film, a book, a film, a book. I might go more toward films. Certainly, those of you watching, you seem to prefer my film analysis to my book analysis. Not sure why. I feel like I kind of do the same basic discussion, just with fewer pictures if it's a book. But whatever. It's cool. I love films. I am a film historian by training, so I am more than happy to talk more about films. And as I say, later in August into September, I'm going to start doing more Disney stuff, because that seems to really interest people. And I'm all for talking about Disney and horror. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. In fact, that's why I actually avoided it mostly, was until, a couple of videos here and there, because it felt like cheating. And this is me studying Gothic narrative in my own weird way, very public way. But yeah, I'll probably, later in August into September, you'll start seeing more of that kind of thing from me. But till then, have a lovely rest of your day, a good evening, good night, sleep tight, don't let the nightmares bite. Bye.